under a reign that stitched the Tiber with silver threads. On December 2 ND, 1549 in Rome, a young usher stood beside the turning hatch that fed the Pauline Chapel, listening to the clink of keys and the dull, seal-sealing thud of doors, while the chapel, partitioned with green and purple draperies, breathed like a vast lung of stone and incense, its air thick with damp wool and whispered Latin, its light a low tide sliding along painted walls. Clausium conclave locked with a key, and the Cardinals would not emerge until they agreed on a pope. So the hinge of the city groaned and the world waited. The usher's hands, red from carrying hot metal, the wet rope gripped a wicker hamper lined with oiled paper, in which lamb ribs lay perfumed with crushed coriander, the bitter candied breath of reduced grape must, the clean line of red wine vinegar, the soft insistence of garlic, while in his pocket a small knife with a silver handle pressed his thigh, its grip engraved with a loop that looked like a silk knot, as if the tool itself remembered that a good blade does not merely divide but helps the pieces find one another again. He hesitated, thinking he saw movement in the rafters. Only shadow, only the hush of a place where history tightens its stitches. And from the other side of the hatch someone whispered, "Silence, pull the cord." So he slid the hamper through and watched it vanish into the revolving dark. And at dawn a rumor would ripple across the steps. Not a wound exactly, but a cut of another kind. A seam in the story. A place where the archive falls. Quiet and gossip begins to speak. And people would ask whose plate had carried the secret and whose breath had warmed the sauce, and why the onions were sweeter than they had any right to be, and your camera fixed and steady, refusing theatrics, could have leaned in close to the glaze that laced those ribs, their surface shining like a single line of silk thread that promised nothing and held everything, then cut to the past that made the night inevitable without ever leaving the present, where the smell already told the plot. Rome in the Renaissance was a double-bolted door, marble brilliance by day, copper fire by night, and power moved on velvet solace, folding distance with a gesture and mending distance with a purse. The Medici habit of turning money into influence, and influence into ritual, was everywhere. In frescoes that taught obedience with color, kink in palaces, where a name could be stitched into stone, in ledgers whose arithmetic braided taxes to absolution ca, and in kitchens where menus knotted patronage to appetite so neatly that a spoon could carry a policy as easily as a stew. The chapel across the courtyard had been curtained into cells, and the city beyond was an argument about who owned what and who had the right to speak aloud. And you could tell the map of obedience by the way the streets curved toward certain doors and away from certain windows. And always a stitch held things together, and a stitch also sealed mouths. Silk thread silence, techniques of control, and the crafts of survival, sharing one spool in a cramped room above a still yard. A kitchen apprentice named Matteo learned how to bind flavors the way a tailor binds a seam, how to keep the grain running straight when the fabric buckles, how to make a sauce, remember the meat it once was and the broth, remember the bones it left. And his master's fame had a way of making apprentices careful, because Bartolomeo Scappi's manner of cutting was not simply to separate, but to join to gather fibers and align grain and make one thing hold to another. And he used to say a knife should not only divide, it should remember where the pieces came from and help them meet again. And the boy believed him, because food, when it fails, falls apart, and when it succeeds, holds like a sentence whose clauses are different but related by care. The older man gave him the small knife with the silver handle and that curious loop, that permanent knot like the signature of a hidden hand. And Matteo used it on onions and herbs and sinew, and on the threads of twine that held roast stew. And he worked with salt and fat and heat, but also with time which cooks, like to think of as a material you can fold. And he learned to rub lamb ribs quick, with salt and ground coriander, until the spice warmed to the skin and capron, released its green-orange breath and learned to crush garlic, until it stopped shouting and began to sing and learned to stir red wine. Vinegar into a spoon of Saba grape, must reduced until sweetness turns syrupy until the tang and sugar reached a treaty neither could achieve alone, and learned that winter food is a language of patience, in which onions surrendered their bite, bones loosen their grip, broth grows articulate in the dark, and the hand that hurries ruins the syntax every time. Markets thinned with cold, lettuce shrank to a tired green, pears bruised at a look, but the butcher stalls showed ribs as decorative as reliquaries, and the smell of animal fat met the smell of wool cloaks and church incense in a truce that felt honest, because nitrogen monoxide one pretended it was anything else. The city's money stalked its clerics, and its clerics stalked its money, and somewhere in that mutual hunt of forces agreed to borrow each other's manners, which is why a bishop could sound like a banker, and a banker could sound like a bishop, and both could stand in front of a painting and talk about light as if light were a currency. And in that grammar, the kitchen became a quiet counter-archive, a place that insisted on naming labor while the ledgers named only results. And Scappi's pages wrote recipes with the sobriety of laws and the conviction that precise instructions could defend the nameless from erasure. And still the nameless vanished, because precision is not power, only the hope of fairness. One evening a woman appeared at the threshold, with the mien of a governess and the gaze of a diplomat, her posture saying she knew the rules, and her eyes saying she knew who wrote them. Her name was Victoria, which might have been a mask, as all good names were in those corridors, and she carried a velvet pouch of notes for someone upstairs, but lingered at the boundary, where steam from the pots braided itself around cold air, and asked, "Can one thing stand for another?" As if continuing a conversation he had missed. Can a stitch become a voice? Can a silence be a kind of writing? And he did not answer at first, because kitchens are trained to keep counsel, and she touched the spool of silk the scullions used to tie roasts, and the thread slid through her fingers like a thought trying to become a sentence, and he said, finally, "Sometimes in cooking what is missing speaks loudest. You can taste the absence of summer. Peaches in January, and it becomes the dish's deepest note." And she smiled a small private victory, and he understood that their car people history permits to be footnotes, and people history refuses to print at all, and those whose names are shortened to initials, and those toll whose letters are filed under someone else's seal, and those whom the archive stitches out of sight. Silk thread silence, the old duet that makes the song of power sound smooth. The conclave ground on like a mill that did not care what grain it took. "Can the rules?" said one attendant, and the reality was 6, and the rules said no messages, and the reality was paper hidden under the tongues of servants, and promises hidden in the folds of purses, and baits ran in the markets with the same energy as gossip, because the city had learned that information loves company, and coin loves company even more. And in kitchens rumor is a spice. A pinch brightens and a spoonful turns bitter. Again a handful burns the tongue, so Matteo kept to his work and slid his hands over lamb ribs, lifting the silver skin where he could, and salting both sides with a calm that comes only from repetition, and laying quarters of onion on the tray for sweetness later. Care for the way their fibers long cooked become almost confessional. And he made the marinade coriander vinegar savor the paste clinging, the scent rising, memory sitting, and he wrapped the rack and let the mixture lay its mild claim on the meat. Overnight, the way a promise lays claim to a morning, be neither legally binding nor easily ignored. The next day he cooked at a low, constant heat, a slow sentence set in the oven, the kind of sentence That accumulates meaning as it goes clause by clause, until the last word makes the first word deepen. And time did what time does when you don't rush it, and the bones let go, and he finished the rack under a hot flame to darken the edges as if drawing a careful outline. Around the face he was not permitted to paint, and the sauce was simple and deliberate, a thread of oil, a single clove of garlic warmed only to fragrance, a spoon of vinegar, 3 of Saba, 2 minutes of simmering to smooth the coral, off the fire, a gloss that would fall over the ribs like a line of ink that explains itself without footnotes. And at the hatch that night the hamper lingered. Sis at the table were the god guardians of order, pried at every loaf and opened every crust. Because nitrogen monoxide closed pies and nitrogen monoxide whole birds meant nitrogen monoxide opportunities for paper to hide inside meat kit. But nitrogen monoxide one can open aroma, and nitrogen monoxide one can parse the seam that runs through a story and makes it hold. So inside the chapel, a whisper artery of scent proceeded from cell to cell. Coriander kneeling beside vinegar, garlic stepping back, onion becoming memory, and minutes later someone stumbled. And it was hunger perhaps, or worrying perhaps, or nothing more than the same body, meeting the same winter in the same room. Yet the city prefers theater to physics, and poison is a word that moves the plot. Without evidence, and the archive formed a frown. The legend cleared its throat, silk thread silence due. Another duet in a score that the public knows by heart. There were questions the next morning, not much of a tribunal more. The velvet edge of consequence, and they asked who flavored what and why this scent, and whose knife with this strange little loop, and he said my master's gift, and then, in a breath that ran longer than he intended, because sometimes your own mouth betrays your caution, he added he chose intention as plainly as ink. When the flame is low and patient, it means to make things meet, and they searched the kitchen, and the knife was taken, and the loop of silver not vanished into someone else's pocket, and there were nitrogen monoxide charges and nitrogen monoxide verdict, a transfer, a warning, a lesson in the ownership of speech, and women's names went missing first, and the rest learned to cook as if the tongue were a dangerous muscle, and the body had to be nourished without the mind being provoked. The markets resumed their haggling, because cities are stubborn about survival caught, and the chapel was undraped and the kitchens cleaned, the black from their hardstones, and the story did not, and so much as gather its threads, and tie them at the back where viewers wouldn't see the knot, and years left their finger marks on everything, and the records itemized processions, and the names of barons, and the color of the hangings in each room, and did not mention the way onions turn kind when the hour is late and the cold is close, and did not mention a woman who sometimes paused on the threshold like an annotation cue, and did not mention a boy whose hands were taught to bind with flavor what history had cut apart with rank, and the knife with the loop lost its trail, and the silk thread did what silk thread doesn't hid until someone needed it. But a few people remembered, not as evidence but as appetite, that one winter the ribs tasted like a decision delayed and a mercy granted, and they carried that taste forward into kitchens where the rules came from experience rather than decree. What remains for you as is a dish and a way to tell it. If you are filming, keep your camera still and let the food move, not the lens, and begin with the date and place to give the scene a pulse. You can count, mention the rain sowing the river, mention keys and draperies and cells 10. Let the smell of the ribs be the line that pulls us back through the curtain, and teach the recipe plainly, because clarity is hospitality. A rack of lamb ribs, the membrane removed, a tablespoon of salt, 3 teaspoons of coriander divided for rub marinade, and sauce sit 2 or 3 cloves of garlic, teaspoon of red wine vinegar for the marinade, and another spoon for the sauce, 2 spoons of Saba, a touch of oil to soften the garlic's edge, 2 or 3 small onions quartered. Rub the ribs with salt and coriander. Crush garlic and stir it with coriander vinegar and Saba, then coat the meat and rest it overnight. The next day, set the ribs over the onions and cook at 135 degrees Celsius to 175 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 hours until the bones and the flesh agree to part. Finish briefly under heat to darken the top. Make the sauce by warming garlic in a little oil, adding vinegar and Saba simmering to minutes. Then pouring the silk bright ribbon over the meat. Serve with the onions, which by then will have remembered every kindness winter forgot. And in your narration you can say that the archive often falls silent, where IT matters and rumor sometimes stands in for the lines that were never written because the hand soup that held the pen was not allowed to sign. And you can suggest that cooks in their small ways say practice a counter-archive binding tastes that would otherwise remain separate, honoring absences by seasoning them gently, naming what can be named and treating the rest with care. You can remind yourself that ethics in storytelling means refusing the theater of harm and choosing implication over spectacle and silk over blood. Still let the themes breathe without turning them into slogans. Power is the right to decide which words appear. Ownership is the right to decide who speaks those words aloud. And the silencing of women can be glimpsed in the way a name drops from a ledger or a letter is filed under a man's seal, and violence appears as symbol only a roof removed long ago, a ration thinned, a life shortened by winter, or are wearing never as a scene to feed on your story refuses that hunger and chooses a steadier diet, and at the end return to the rain and the hatch and the knife with the little loop, and imagine that the knot was not a flourish, but a promise that things sundered can be joined, but that a patient fire makes strangers into relatives, that a sauce may be a form of listening, and say that the dish tastes balanced, garlic present but polite, coriander complex and citrus shadowed, Saba deep and humane, vinegar clipped and clarifying, onions kind, and say that it is not quite a barbecue sauce, and that is precisely the point, because it is a way of speaking before the grammar hardened, and policies change and regimes change, and kitchens endure, and if power today still prefer silence, answer by giving credit on screen to growers and butchers and historians and cooks whose names were not kept, and if ownership today still tries to keep the recipe locked behind a door, answer by teaching it clearly and generously, without romance where there should be precision, and without cynicism, coup where there should be tenderness. And if the old habit of cutting voices out reappears in your comments or your algorithms, do what Matteo learned to do when the oven door closed and he had only time for company. Lower the heat, let patience thicken what is thin, and serve when ready, not before. Q might add the market morning that followed the election, because endings need air. Fishmongers rinse scales from their boards. A mule sneezed dust into a shaft of sun, an old woman who sold EGGS and listened more accurately than most ambassadors told a neighbor she had predicted the outcome by the smell that drifted from the chapel. Not incense, not wax, something darker and kinder. And the neighbor laughed, onions. And she shrugged, kindness, then the onions are kindness. And behind them a boy balanced a tray of bread that sent steam in thin white lines like new stitches on clean cloth. Q might add that Matteo found work in another kitchen where the owner asked no questions and paid late, but paid and where Vittoria's absence gathered into the shape of a presence he could not name, and that he cooked ribs sometimes when the weather turned, and wrote the recipe in a notebook in a hand, so careful you could almost hear the quills breathe. And at the bottom of the page he drew a small knot, like the one on the silver handle, and beside it, a single word he would never say aloud together. If you need a closing sentence for your video, give the lesson small enough to fit on the breath you have left. Joining is harder than cutting. Listening is heavier than speaking. And dinner done with care big is a form of consent between strangers. Then let the steam lift in one ribbon from the platter. Let it curve like silk bed and let the camera stay still while the fork slides in and the bones relax and the glaze holds its line and the rain outside loses interest in drama and settles for rhythm. And if someone asks afterwards where the secret was, say that there was nitrogen monoxide secret only attention, which is what ethics looks like in a kitchen. And if someone asks whether the story is true, say that the archive is a house with many rooms, and some of them have doors that only open inward. And if we cannot enter, we can at least stand outside and describe the light, and in the meantime eat well salt wisely honor absence. Turn heat low tie the knot past the plate. After the long journey through our story, from the rain-stitched streets of Renaissance Rome to the quiet heat of Scappi's kitchen, we finally arrive at the dish that tied all those threads together. Now, let's step out of the past and into our own kitchens. Here is the modern version of that historic lamb rib recipe. First, the ingredients, then the step-by-step method. To make the lamb ribs, you will need 1 rack of lamb ribs, about 1 to 1.3 kilos, 1 tablespoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 2 or 3 small onions quartered, 2 or 3 garlic cloves crushed, 1.5 teaspoons of ground coriander, and 1 teaspoon of black pepper. For the marinade, you will need 1 tablespoon of red wine vinegar, 3 tablespoons of Saba, or if you cannot find it, a mix of grape or pomegranate molasses with a splash of balsamic, 1 crushed garlic clove, 1 teaspoon of coriander, and 1 teaspoon of olive oil. And for the finishing glaze, you will need 1 tablespoon of Saba, 1 teaspoon of red wine vinegar, 1 tablespoon of olive oil, 1 teaspoon of coriander, and 1 small garlic clove used only to perfume the oil. Start by removing the thin membrane from the back of the lamb rack. Lift it with the tip of a knife, grip it with a paper towel, and pull it off. This will help the meat cook more tender. Mix the salt, coriander, and black pepper together and rub this dry spice blend all over the ribs. Let the meat rest for a few minutes. Now prepare the marinade. In a bowl, combine the Saba, red wine vinegar, crushed garlic, coriander, and olive oil. Spread this mixture over the lamb, coating every surface. For the best flavor, cover and refrigerate the rack for at least 4 hours or ideally overnight. When you are ready to cook, preheat the oven to 135 degrees Celsius or 275 Fahrenheit. Spread the quartered onions on a baking tray and place the lamb rack on top of them. Cover the tray tightly with foil. Slow cook the ribs for about 2.5 to 3 hours. When the meat starts to pull away from the bones easily, you have reached the perfect point. Remove the foil. Increase the oven temperature to 220 degrees Celsius or 430 Fahrenheit and roast the ribs for another 5 to 8 minutes, just until the edges darken and caramelize. While the ribs finish in the oven, prepare the glaze. Warm the olive oil in a small saucepan. Add the small garlic clove and let it gently perfume the oil for about 1 minute. Then remove and discard the garlic. Add the Saba, the red wine vinegar, and the coriander. Let this mixture simmer for about 2 minutes until it becomes glossy and slightly thickened. Take the ribs out of the oven and let them rest for a few minutes. Slice between the bones, then drizzle the silky glaze over the meat. Serve the ribs with the roasted onions, which by now will have turned sweet and tender from the long, slow cooking. Take the ribs out of the oven and let them rest for a few minutes. Slice between the bones, then drizzle the silky glaze over the meat. Serve the ribs with the roasted onions, which by now will have turned sweet and tender from the long, slow cooking. And as you enjoy this dish, remember, history is full of flavors waiting to be rediscovered. If you want to taste more forgotten recipes and stories from the past, follow us and join the journey to history's other remarkable flavors.